Yes, I am a historian, and yes, I will be bringing a little history to this tonight. I would like to flag that there needs to be a content warning in my text for intravenous drug use. If that is an issue, please feel free to leave. I won't be offended at all, and I can fill the space real quickly by saying that I'm really happy to be here, and thank you very much. I hope this doesn't bore you at all. You know how like in history classes, the history teacher's like the only one having fun? That's going to be me right now. So this is one that I did in my undergrad. Top marks. And it's called New York City and the Needle. It's an overview. Sorry. Oh, thank you so much. It's an overview of New York City's relationship to the heroin subculture. I'm going to start around the 1940s, 50s. I do kind of skip the 60s, 70s, 80s a little bit. I think you'll get why, because it very much stays the same until we're going to get into some juicy parts in the late 80s, 90s. I really hope that you enjoy this. It sounds a lot better than I'm starting it.
It sounds amazing.
Excellent. So, intertwined with the history of New York City is a lingering heroin subculture that has permeated the city's urban environment. It is through the urban spaces of New York that heroin use has spread. Those who had it shared it. Those who sought it found it. The empire of heroin trade was centralized in New York, and the drug subculture was embedded into the streets of Times Square and Broadway. Heroin's presence has changed New York, spreading and growing in popularity from the 1920s to 1990s. Two writers presented here, both individuals who reflect on their own relationship with drug use, give insight into the life of a heroin user in New York, William S. Burroughs and Maya Svalovitz. Burroughs' novel-turned memoir, Junkie, Confessions of an Unredeemed Drug Addict from 1953, is a first-hand account which gives blunt, poetic insights into the life of a heroin user on the streets of early post-war New York, followed by a Vice article by Maya Svalovitz, A Brief History of New York City's Heroin Scene, released in 2015, which focuses on the 1960s, 80s, and 90s throughout the American government's war on drugs. These writers provide valuable insight that is only achieved by witnessing the heroin subculture on a personal level. Heroin has a close relationship to the urban sphere, and when in urban spaces, it has thrived. Physical space facilitates the accessibility and spread of drugs, and the broader history of heroin use is intimately linked to the history of New York City's heroin subculture. That brings us to part one. Jazz is a gateway drug. Urban spaces are powerful through their potential to introduce outsiders to gathering subculture groups. Taking heroin or its brother morphine required knowledge in using an eyedropper or hypodermic needle. Urban spaces become places where knowledge on drugs and drug use are transferred. The drug subculture of New York needed the physical realm to thrive, and the relationship between drug use and urban environments could not be clearer than in New York's Times Square, where heroin first boomed following World War II. Heroin arrived in America through New York. The Jewish and Italian traffickers smuggled it in through the ports during the 1920s, and from there it was distributed among gangs and purchased by dealers, steadily reaching far past New York City's limits. The further from New York, the more expensive it became. The price difference itself conveyed that proximity or close connection to New York was the key to a steady, affordable supply of heroin. It was within the immediate years following World War II that the heroin market would begin to rise among popular use, and that popularity can be attributed to the impact of the earlier jazz culture of Times Square. New York's heroin subculture in the 1920s emerged from within the jazz scene. It was within Times Square's bars, cafes, and live music joints that heroin found the perfect market. Jazz musicians did not merely use heroin, they flaunted it. The bars provided the perfect location for drug use to mix with leisure, and the reputation of the jazz musicians reinforced the image of heroin as a drug which cultivated musical knowledge and skill. Above all, though, these locations translated drug knowledge, introducing novices to active users. Times Square was the center of jazz, and through jazz, it became a place for heroin and heroin users alike. The jazz musicians were, by virtue of popular opinion, anti-square, hip, and happening. Before heroin, marijuana was it. Once heroin became the in drug, it was quickly picked up by most and became acceptable behavior among the jazz joints to use and talk about it. Heroin spread among the musicians, close fans, and drunks who frequented Times Square, and junk became another facet of jazz's culture. Charlie Ruse said, "You had to get high to play," end quote. Heroin use was not only a part of the jazz ritual, it was commonly believed among users that heroin incubated a musician's ability or allowed them to more intimately relate to and enjoy music. Because this is a history essay, I do have notes if anyone wants to double check me on any of these things. As jazz musicians used and celebrated heroin among their own circles, Times Square fostered a drug subculture, which swiftly extended to outer crowds. Following World War II, this culture began to flourish. The subculture fostered its own language and terminology, leading William S. Burroughs to include a glossary in Junkie, which translated common jive talk. The drug users who emerged in the later post-war period developed a different culture to the hip jazz musicians. In Junkie, Burroughs confesses to wandering New York streets at night, pickpocketing drunk men and stealing at any opportunity in order to sustain his habit. His own addiction made Burroughs privy to the life of heroin users and how heroin permeated the streets of New York. Junkie captures the grittiness of New York and addiction, tied up with Burroughs' deadpan and insightful prose. Describing Broadway, he wrote, 103rd is a subway stop, a crowded block. This is junk territory. Junk haunts the cafeteria, roams up and down the block, sometimes half crossing Broadway to rest on one of the island beaches, a ghost in daylight on a crowded street. Experienced drug users like Burroughs view New York through the eyes of a needle. He often refers to the ability to sense junk rather than physically locate it. He wrote, I don't spot junk neighborhoods by the way they look, but by the feel, somewhat the same process by which a dowser locates hidden water. I am walking along and suddenly the junk in my cells moves and twitches like a dowser's wand. Junk here. Through Junkie, the effect heroin has on the physical environment is tangible, but heroin's impact also exists as a force or a feeling that other experienced drug users can recognize. Burroughs suggests the feeling of junk never completely fades once it is settled in a place. He writes, there are no more junkies at 103rd and Broadway waiting for their connection. The connection has gone somewhere else. But the feel of junk is still there. It hits you at the corner, follows you around the block, and falls away like a discouraged panhandler as you walk on. The public realm of Times Square and Broadway, even after heroin retreated to private spaces, were marked by the drug subculture which had once dominated the streets. It became a part of that space's identity. Burroughs frames these places forever altered by junk. This may stem from his own state of mind in also having his life changed irreparably by his dependency. Heroin's identity as a jazz-in drug would dramatically change in the following years. It was spread among African American and Latino youth across America, spurring the American government's subsequent war on drugs, which would attempt to curb harmful drug use. Heroin use would not dramatically decline, but its reputation and image would be considerably altered, which leads us to part two. Are we still good? Part two now? Part two, which is the epidemic and the war. And I've opened this with a quote from one of the texts that I examined, which is, heroin did not need to be pushed, for the experience sold itself. In the 1950s, the 1950s saw heroin use accelerate to epidemic standards among American youth. And New York still had the highest use of any American city. It's the highest use of heroin in the world. In the early 1950s, New York's law enforcement reported approximately 500 new cases of heroin use a year. Heroin was most prominently on the rise in African American and Latino communities, and white users were now a minority. African American and Latino youth were exposed to heroin through community links, rather than through the public spaces of Times Square and Broadway. Information about heroin and its sensations was shared between peers. New York's minority neighborhoods, which existed as clusters of community groups, now faced an epidemic. The youth in these neighborhoods primarily moved and consumed heroin. The struggles of addiction and heavy withdrawals were common knowledge, but this did not slow youth interest in the new drugs. And sociologist Snyder writes, these youths took heroin because they were swayed by the example of older peers, but the growing presence of the drug and the concentration of drug users in their neighborhoods, and by their adolescent desire to be part of the hip, new happening thing. The rise of heroin peaked in 1951, but it has failed to decline since. The number of heroin users has been more or less consistently to the common era, and the American government institutions estimate in both 1990s to the present day that there was a consistent 1 to 1.5 million active users nationally. Maya Svalovitz was an active heroin user in New York who first used the drug in 1985. Svalovitz has since become a successful reporter and writer and has reflected on her and others' experiences as heroin users in a Vice article published in 2015. Svalovitz noted that heroin has undergone transformation in its image, identity, and even the manner in how it is sold and acquired. In 1971, Richard Nixon declared to Congress and America, in New York City, more people between the ages of 15 and 35 years die as a result of narcotics than from any other single cause. End quote. This speech marked Nixon's war on drugs, where he decreed to introduce measures such as enforcement efforts to further tighten the noose around the necks of drug peddlers and aim to halt the drug traffic by striking at the legal producers. Street dealing of heroin in the 1970s consisted mostly of small $10 street bags, pretty cheap, the equivalent of Burroughs' $3 street bags back in the day. Heroin trade in New York was bold almost tauntingly in the public sphere, with dispensaries where users could drop money through a slot and receive their desired drugs through a slot in the bottom. Man-operated heroin vending machines and additional open-air bazaars appeared in poorer neighborhoods, often where there were abandoned buildings available to utilize. One such neighborhood was Manhattan's Alphabet City, where Richard Lloyd purchased dope among lines of people as if you were going to a hit movie. Heroin in New York was an innovative business. Like most business models, branding soon followed. The branding of street bags emerged from the New York market in the 70s, using established symbols of major fashion brands such as Nike or Gucci, or simply creating a signature that is printed and wrapped around the drug. However, in the 1980s, open-air trading of heroin was rapidly declining under Ronald Reagan's redeclaration of the war on drugs. Svalovitz, who began using in this time, noted that street dealers were the prime targets for law enforcement. But the heroin market was notable for its comebacks, and fear of imprisonment did not slow the dealers. Svalovitz writes, nonetheless, by the early 1990s, the Lower East Side heroin trade had bounced right back. Sean, a writer who did not want to use his real name, lived in an apartment near a corner that was famous for street sales for decades. A daily user of all types of drugs since his teen, Sean decided he wanted to try heroin when he was 22 in 1994. Since dealers hung out in the doorway of his building, he didn't have to go far to get it. And then a quote from Sean, it was essentially as easy and sometimes easier to get dope where I was living than to get a taco. Sean, in the above quote, he purchased heroin from a stranger on the street, which was more or less the irregular way to first be exposed to heroin. Svalovitz was first introduced to heroin herself through a social connection, similar to the African American and Latino youth of the 50s and 60s. For Svalovitz, the connection was a couple known to her boyfriend. This led her to develop connections with small-time dealers who sold mainly to a small circle, and they were known as indoor dealers. And it may seem in the modern technological age that heroin trade was moving beyond the physical urban environment, but the urban space was still very prevalent in spreading heroin use. The initial connection between user and dealer evidently emerges out of broader social connections between casual users and novices who are interested in using heroin. The minority youth of the 50s and 60s and Svalovitz, who began using in the 80s, all first sourced heroin through a social connection related to the surrounding neighborhood and environment. Yet heroin is decidedly less conspicuous on the streets of New York in this current era, but there are still neighborhoods which are characterized by their proximity to heroin markets. Svalovitz writes that heroin still lives on the Lower East Side, in Harlem, and some outer borough neighborhoods. Street trade is not as hip as the jazz musicians imagined heroin used to be, and it is much more difficult now to sell on the streets with increased police enforcement. But heroin has not left New York, and New York City is still very much the largest consumer of heroin in the entire world. It has occupied the city. And during some periods, heroin was so blatant and accessible across New York streets that law enforcement has struggled to define it. The purpose of this essay was to unveil how those who have experienced the lifestyle that accompanies long-time heroin use have an intimate knowledge on heroin's accessibility, as well as its movements and presence in urban areas. The insight provided by Burroughs and Svalovitz is immensely important in understanding how the heroin subculture in New York has transformed over several decades, but why heroin continues to move throughout other cities and other urban environments. Urban drug use transforms public streets and avenues, altering drug accessibility and neighborhoods. The heroin epidemic spread through disadvantaged neighborhoods among minority youth. The heroin subculture has survived years of challenge in the wake of the war on drugs and has refused to vanish from New York streets. After long years of suffering due to addiction, William S. Burroughs died while dependent on methadone, and Meyer Svalovitz is a successful author and writes extensively on assisting and empowering those who suffer with drug use and addiction. Thank you very much.